We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
What is the cost of war economically? Well, for that, we have to ask an economist. And joining us today is Liberty Nation's Economics Affairs Editor, Mr. Andrew Moran. Thanks for being here, Andrew.
Thank you for having me, and I enjoy your haircut. For people listening,
thank you very much.
Mark got a haircut.
Just for those who are listening on audio, that's not an important point. What is an important point, however, Andrew, is how economies function in times of war. And I think this is quite an overlooked aspect. Now, it seems to me that, and indeed our most recent guest, Nazar, the Ukrainian soldier, informed us that Ukraine is vacillating between a wartime economy and an attempt at a free market economy. And that's a difficult needle to thread. But I wonder about the United States of America, Andrew, and because obviously America isn't involved militarily, boots on the ground, and yet it seems that the country is switching between wartime economy, free market economy, to whatever suits its particular model and goals best at the time. What's your take on that?
Well, I find it fascinating that the U.S. is just spending, $7 trillion a year subsidizing wars in the Middle East and Europe and potentially in East Asia. Inflation is higher than it was during the Second World War. So I find it fascinating the fact that, the U.S. is spending all of this money, and in one time it's a peacetime economy, the next time it's a wartime economy. And the only thing that's missing from the current conditions is rations, of course, which who knows if that'll ever come. But for now, there's no rations at the very least.
I think if there's going to be any rationing, it's going to be of energy rather than foods, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But the only thing you can say, the good thing from the current economic landscape is that the U.S. is producing more oil than other countries across the globe, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Russia, at around 13 million barrels per day. So that's the one thing that's gonna benefit the U.S. if there were ration discussions.
So let's talk about what happens with Ukraine and the US after, presumably, that there is an end point to this conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Now, the US actually has quite a bit of investment going in there, isn't it? Now, is that, I think that's probably a good investment long term, right? Because it's a developing market.
Yeah, so there's already discussions of the U.S. investing in the post-war rebuilding of Ukraine. So the main public policy discussion occurring right now in Washington is confiscating seized Russian central bank assets, liquidating this money, and then transferring the funding to Ukraine in order for them to use that money to rebuild the infrastructure. The second, it comes from the private sector, and a lot of these private sector companies, they want to appear to be good and have goodwill and benevolent, and they're already planning to invest billions of dollars to building new factories, building new banks, building new buildings all across Ukraine. So I said from the beginning of this war that in the future, no matter what happens, this would be the best thing to happen to Ukraine, because before the war, Ukraine was just a cesspool of poverty. It wasn't performing well economically, and now in the coming years, they're going to attract all this investment, all this capital outflows. They're not going to, no matter what the U.S. administration says, they're not going to pay back these loans. They're not going to repay the U.S. taxpayers. None of this is going to happen. So it's just Ukraine's getting all this free money, and they get all this private sector investment, and they get Russia's $300 billion in frozen assets.
But this is slightly different to what we would normally term nation building, a la the Bush era, isn't it?
How's it any different? You're still investing all this money.
Because there is a nation there, essentially, already,
Yes.
and this is just
Yes.
rebuilding it.
Yes.
Whereas in these other places, it was mostly desert and oil wells.
Yeah, but in Ukraine, the buildings are destroyed, the bridges are decimated. There's not much infrastructure in a lot of the coast and all the places that border with Russia. So I guess you can call it quasi nation building, because you're still investing tens of billions of dollars, whether in private or public investment.
And do you consider that an investment?
Well, I'm sure the administration considers it an investment. I mean, I think it's just a waste of money, but the administration's not going to care what I'm thinking.
So with America doing this kind of spending, it's obviously munition spendings, a lot of it is, which means production back in the States, right? Which is generating stuff for the economy. Now, this kind of brings us back to is it a wartime economy or is it a free market economy? Now, am I right in thinking that for America, it would be better financially if they classed it as a wartime economy or treated it as a wartime economy?
Well,
Treated US.
Mitch McConnell, he was on X probably about a year ago, and he said that the war in Ukraine is fantastic for the U.S. economy because all these weapons manufacturers, they're getting all this money from the government and they're creating jobs and stimulating the U.S. economy. I find that absolutely absurd. I disagree with the entire premise. I disagree entirely with the idea that you need a war to stimulate an economy to bolster up the economic landscape. That was the whole premise behind the Second World War in the U.S. under FDR. So this is great for this economy. And then after that, Keynes and long argued that it was because of the Second World War why the Depression ended. So many Keynesians keep making this argument that you need war to have to achieve economic growth. It's the broken window fallacy, as Austrians tout.
Let's just very briefly, Andrew, give me a quick overview of what the US economy is looking like today.
Well, inflation is still above trend. Interest rates still at 23-year high. The GDP is going to have another hot print, but it's mostly fueled, well, not mostly, but at least one third fueled by government spending. A lot of debt consumption by consumers themselves. So this is a high inflation, high debt economy.
Do you think that this will change around in any perceivable way before the 2024 election?
No, if you look at all the economist projections these days, it's all that inflation is still going to be hover around 3%. I speak to some economists, they say it's going to hover higher to 4 or 5% throughout the rest of the year.
Andrew Moran, thanks ever so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network from our flagship station in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guest today, Dave Patterson, Nazar, the Ukrainian soldier, and economics guru Andrew Moran for being here and joining us. And also extend my thanks to you, the listeners at home, who take the time each week to tune in and join the fun. Thanks for being here. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.